Hi, this is Jared from Yellow Wagani again. In the second video on histograms, we're going to talk about how do you actually utilize this histogram in the real world while you're taking pictures. So the first thing you want to do when you're taking a picture is you want to say, is there any one thing that's really important that it has to be right? So when you look at this shot, you might say the pica needs to be right, but the way photography really works is if you get one tonality to correct, everything else will fall into place. So the thing that's the most common in this shot is this white background. This is sort of a high key shot, and I wanted that background to really stand out. So white, this is snow. Snow is not pure white. It shouldn't be touching your very right edge, but it should be close. And if you look at where this is, it's right up along the edge. We still got a gap there though, so there's not a blinky. So we're always looking to avoid the blinkies. We don't want it to be touching the edge, but we want to get exposures right. You want to get it correct in the camera so you get the best absolute detail that you can then go home and do your editing with the rest of your software to get the most out of your pictures. So let's look at this. I sort of have a bunch of shots that go through a bunch of different tonalities, and often the background is easier to use than the animal itself. So here's a Wyoming ground squirrel. And the sun wasn't shining necessarily out too bright here, so the snow kind of had a little bit of a cast to it, but I wanted to be able to see the landscape where this ground squirrel was living. This was an April snowstorm, and I wanted to show detail in the snow. So if you look, my snow is a little bit farther left in this shot because I wanted to show you the tonalities, the differences between the bright and the dark snow here. And then once you get the snow right, the ground squirrel, his tan body, his black eye, everything else is going to come into place. And that's the key. So white is going to be over here on the right. Remember that white is on the right. So here's a coyote. This coyote brings us to a really simple solution. We want to expose for the blinkies. So what's going to be blinkies? This area right here is really bright. This is really bright. But if you look, not all of the snow is super bright. There's just these few areas. And we go and take a look at our histogram. We have just a teeny little gap there on the very right edge so that we're not overexposing and getting blinkies. As long as we take a look, the general rule of thumb is if you have white in your picture, keep adjusting your exposure brighter and brighter and brighter until you get blinkies. Then go back one or two clicks back to the negative side so that the blinkies disappear. And there you'll have the right exposure. That's called exposing for the whites. So we take a look. Here's our snow, and this is our stack of snow, but is the snow pure white? Not really. There's kind of lots of medium grays and colors. There's a lot of pattern in this snow all over the place, and that's what we really want. Our coyote's kind of a mix of all over this, so we can't usually use him, but we can definitely use that. But the big thing is there's some pure whites in there, and we can use that to make sure we don't overexpose. Same idea here. This was a shot where the sun was shining. You can see the shadow was pretty direct, and the biggest issue was getting these footprints. So it's really made the shot of this piker running on the snow, making sure those footprints stood out. And if you want any brighter, we would get them to be blinkies. And I don't want blinky footprints. I want the footprints to really stand out against the snow. You can see how they're lighter and the snow's kind of darker. So look where this spike is. This is all this sort of grayish white snow. Snow is not pure white. It's got a little bit of gray in it. So let's get away from winter. Let's look at something more towards fall. This is a moose losing his velvet on the west side of the park, and we have tannish grass, but it's not perfectly tan. It's got a little bit of green in it, so it's not going to be as bright as that grass we talked about in the first video on the histogram. So our spike, this is our grass. So we can use that as an idea to make sure we get it correct, but what's even more important is what else do we have here? Anything close to the edge, and yes, there's a spike. What does this spike mean though? This is black, so this is really close to the dark side. That has to be these pure black areas right here on our moose. And we don't want our moose to have any pure black, so we want to move that off to the right. So in a shot like this, we'd probably want to expose one click to the bright side, 1/3 of a stop brighter, to get those shadow details to come out. The other thing you have to make sure is these don't turn into blinkies on that next side. So it's always a compromise. You're looking for the best combination of the two. So here's a shot with some nice soft light. This mule deer buck, he was just approached me, and I just took a few shots before I had to walk away. But what can we use here to make sure we got the shot right? There's nothing that's pure white in this shot. There's just a little bit, but that's going to be really tough to use as a blinky. So we can start to use other tonalities. Look up here. This is very dark. It's sort of a darkish medium tan. And that tan being just about medium should be right about close to the middle of the histogram, and right there it is. So it's a little bit brighter than 18% gray. Here's a really sort of mid-bright area right here. So that's this spike right here. And then the darker gray of the mule deer is going to be over on this side with the more details of the blacks coming out to the side. We can use all those together to apply and make sure we got the exposure correct. So here, no white really that we can speak of except for a little bit right here, but the better thing to do is this is green without the sun shining. And green without the sun shining should be just left of dead center. So green grass, a lot of green plants without the sun shining should be just left of dead center, and that's where our spike is. And if our spike's there, we know everything else should be correct, and we got a good shot. What happens when the sun does shine on that grass? Well, now our spike goes right about dead center. So green grass with the sun shining, we should have a spike right in the center. So you don't always predict histograms really, really well, and that's always a challenge for a lot of photographers. What would you expect here? You'd expect, this is a medium, sort of lighter white colors and some tans. You'd expect maybe a spike, but there's not a whole lot of whites. There's a lot of variation, and that's why this histogram stretches out on both sides. This is what a lot of histograms potentially will look like, but not every histogram is a perfect shape like a pyramid or a bell curve. You're looking for the shapes that are appropriate. So go to this shot. This is a sort of a dull green, very average. It's not really, really dark. It's not really, really bright. So it should fall right in the middle. The sun wasn't shining. So we got that right. Because we got that right, our purples came out just about perfect, and our B, the dark areas of the B showed out. Plus these areas, the lighter areas, all fell into place. This white area right here on the flower is not a blinky. It's got some space to fall into play. So sometimes green isn't always these medium colors. Sometimes green is really dark. So if it's dark, it should fall towards the dark side. So here it was in the shadow of all these green areas. That really made this butterfly and the thistle stand out, and that's what you're looking for. So if you take a look here, we got a bighorn sheep standing on gray rocks. We got a camouflaged animal, tannish gray rocks with a little bit of green and this mix, but it's all very medium. There is some brighter areas, there's some darker areas. So what did you expect to see? And that's exactly this type of histogram. Here's dead middle, we've got a slightly brighter, slightly darker, and we do have a few areas you could use. So it's middle, so we should have a histogram that's kind of middle-ish. If the spike was over here, you'd be too bright. If the spikes were over here, you'd be too dark. But we'd have some potential blinky spots right there and right here that might give you a little bit of clue that you might have to go just a little bit darker to make sure it's just perfect. So sometimes white, you don't want it to be a blinky. Like right here, the bald eagle's head, we want detail in those feathers. And it's always a compromise. So we don't want to go all the way till that's a blinky, or the whole shot would be way too bright. But we also want to make sure we get detail in the dark feathers here of the eagle's body. So take a look over here. This is another thing that we always want to pay attention to. Not just the bright side, but the dark side of the histogram. We want the shadows to come out and have some detail. So if this was touched up against, that would tell us we're too dark. So there's another key that we could use to make sure we have this shot right. This is sort of a medium blue sky, slightly lighter. And this spike right here is that medium blue sky. So if that's the color I want it to be, it should be right there. Then the rest of the histogram would fall into place. But I want to get a little bit more detail, and I got to consider down here, this is blue sky with a really soft cloud moving through, and these feathers are kind of more gray. So this is the shot that I took, and then I would adjust it in editing to make these whites just a little bit more detailed. And that's what you're looking to do. You're not trying to get the perfect shot out there in the field. You're looking to get the perfect shot for the data that you can then edit, because if it was too black, you'd lose some detail. If it was too bright, you'd lose detail as well. Here's a beaver. So what do you use? Well, the easiest thing to use is make sure that's not a blinky. And if you look, we're really close, but not on it. But also we can confirm, is the beaver dark enough? And here's our spike. This is pretty dark fur in there and pretty dark water all through there. You can use those two elements to make sure that, yes, we have a dark beaver and we have just a little bit of blinkies. Quite often when I go shoot these beavers in the summertime, pardon me, you get a histogram right down the middle, and that's way too bright. You should have dark beavers, so you got to make a negative adjustment. Playing on that same idea, here's a magpie. How do you take shots like this when you don't know what's going to happen? Well, this magpie kept landing on the ground, and he was following around all these people. So to make sure to get the shot, I took a test shot of the gravel. This is actually the pavement of the road, and it was sort of darker than average gray. So there's our gravel. If I got that right when I saw the magpie for just a split second while they were landing, I could get a shot where I get the detail in the blacks, and I didn't get blinkies. That's only about the only bright spot. There's a little bit of a bright spot, but birds like this and animals like this are very, very challenging. We got black next to white, and cameras really don't do well in those situations. So the best thing was to take a test shot. And I know what the road's not going to run away, so I could just take that quick test shot, make sure it's perfect. Using that same sort of idea on a macro type of shot, we want detail in this dark area of the log. I want you to be able to see all the grain and the nitty bits there. But also, you look across, this is dark, but this is sort of medium light, and that's kind of average gray, and this is getting a little bit lighter. And even in the yellows of the leaves, this is really bright yellow, and that's dull yellow, and this is sort of a really brightish tan. So they're kind of colors all over the place, and that's what you get. You get a histogram that's kind of all over the darks and a little bit in the middles and a little bit in the bright side as well. So how do you make sure you get this right? Well, the big thing I wanted to make sure of is the yellow was yellow, and yellow falls right about here on the histogram. And I also wanted to make sure, see, there's not a lot of yellow, so it should be right in there. And that's kind of tough. I can't use this spike, but I can use this dark area. That's a big portion of the picture. And to make sure it's dark, it should be about 1/5 off from the side of the edge of the histogram. So we'll put this in real place. So here's a shot I took, and I was really concerned. I was getting a little bit of blinkies in these areas right here, and that was just a bit too bright. I sort of washed it out. So I wanted to get a bit more contrast. The way to get more contrast and get rid of the blinkies is go negative. So I want one click, 1/3 of a stop to the negative side of the meter, and got the shot this way. And that brought out a bit more detail. I did lose a little bit in the shadows here, but I had to bring down those blinkies. Here was a quick test shot I took. I saw the beaver out the water. I wanted these green grass area to look green. It was very dark and late in the evening, but I wanted it to be brighter. And this is where the green should be, first what we saw, but I didn't want you to see green grass in the shade. I wanted you to see it look like it more sunny, so I wanted the spike to be more towards the middle. Remember, middle is where sunny grass would be, so I moved the whole exposure to the bright side, and look, we got sunny green grass. Not perfectly sunny, had to do a little bit of white balance adjustment, but that's what we're looking for. So here we got a moose, and moose are really always hard to expose because they're always very dark, and this was really challenging because we had dark shadow areas down here, and then the antlers were picking up some of the light, and they were starting to shine. So how do you get the proper exposure for this? Well, real quick, you could take a shot with the antlers and make sure they're not blinkies, and they were really close, so I tried to minimize the blinkies. But how much darker do you go before you start losing the shadows? And that's where you start to use this level. Right there's this is our moose. This is where most of our moose is. And you can see it's about 1/5 away from the edge. That's dark. That 1/5 line is where very dark things are in shadow. Shadows are right in the middle of that, between 1/5 edge. From there to there, that's pure black. So very little of it is pure black, and I wanted to avoid that as much as possible. Here's a ram. So we have some white, so we can use his nose to make sure those aren't blinkies. But the sun wasn't shining in this shot. It was actually snowing. So what could I use to make sure everything's correct? Well, we got tan grass. Lots of tan grass here. And there's our spike. We know tan grass should be somewhere right around in here. And that's exactly right. So if we get that one thing correct, everything else falls into place. And by making sure this is bright enough, we made sure we pulled the dark area of our histogram away from the edge so the shadows filled in. We could see the shadow detail underneath the legs and even in the background there. Very important. So we get these really challenging situations. So a lot of times, you just don't have an opportunity to get the animal in the right light. So this is a coyote hanging out in some pretty nasty light. And I wanted to get him just right, so the best way was let's look for the blinkies. We'd look for blinkies right there and underexpose. Here's a shot where, there's only one area, so that's going to be blinkies right here and right here. So I made sure the shot was bright enough and then went down just a click. If you go too far, you'd lose all the shadow detail here. You can see how there's some information there, and there's a lot of it on this dark side. If I went brighter, more would come out. So take a look. So here's with this moose here. What color do we use? There's no white. Well, we can use the green. Green, when sunshine, should be right about the middle. And there's our spike. A lot of it's in the middle. Perfect. What do we use here with the Abert squirrel? Because we got a lot of shadows. I want to make sure the shadows aren't too dark. The sun was shining pretty harsh. Well, the one thing I could use the blinkies on the branch right here. But I could also use the blue sky. Lots of blue sky. Blue sky that's about this color should be right there on a histogram. I put the blue sky right there, and bam, perfect shot. That's how you use the histogram.